A wealthy man, broken by loss, meets a young girl with nothing but courage in her heart. What starts as a passing conversation will turn into a journey of healing, truth, and transformation, where love and wisdom come from the most unexpected places. Under the glow of city lights and the shadow of towering skyscrapers, there lived a man who had everything the world could ever offer, yet nothing that truly mattered. His name was spoken in boardrooms and printed in headlines, his fortune vast enough to bend the world to his will. Luxury cars lined his garage, his penthouse overlooked the glittering skyline, and his bank accounts overflowed with numbers that most could not even imagine. But behind that empire was a man hollowed by grief, a man whose heart was described by those who dared to whisper as full of riches yet empty of warmth. He carried his loneliness like an invisible crown, wearing power on the outside, but bleeding, sorrow on the inside. Friends had long since vanished, lovers had betrayed him, and family ties had withered under the weight of loss. All that remained was an endless cycle of meetings, contracts, and business dinners that blurred one into another. He lived in crowded rooms but was always alone, his laughter forced, his smiles rehearsed, and his nights echoing with silence. It was on one such ordinary afternoon that fate decided to intervene. Escaping the suffocating air of his office, he wandered into a quiet corner of the city, a place far removed from his usual world of glass towers and velvet carpets. He sat at a small cafe, dressed in clothes too fine for the setting, his watch, worth more than the shop itself. People passed him by without a second glance, most too busy to care, others too intimidated to stare. But among the footsteps and chatter, there came a presence that stopped him in his tracks. A young girl, her skin dark as the night sky and her eyes sharp yet kind, stood across from him. She wasn't dressed in wealth, nor did she carry the air of someone who had anything material to offer. And yet, in her gaze was something that unsettled him more than any rival ever could. She saw him, not his tailored suit, not the car keys on the table, not the aura of power he wore like armor. She saw the man beneath it all, broken and weary. There, eyes locked for a moment too long, and before he could look away, she spoke. Her words cut through the noise of the cafe like a blade through silk. "I can fix your broken heart." He blinked, stunned, certain he had misheard. People didn't speak to him like this. They flattered, they begged, they negotiated. No one dared to address his pain, not even those he had once trusted. For a brief moment, silence stretched between them. Then, almost involuntarily, he let out a low laugh. The sound was bitter, hollow, carrying no trace of joy. "You fix my heart?" he said, disbelief lacing every syllable. "Do you have any idea how many doctors, therapists, so-called experts have tried? Do you know how much money I've spent looking for something to fill this emptiness?" But the girl didn't flinch. She didn't shrink from his tone or his arrogance. She stood tall, her eyes never wavering from his. When she spoke again, her voice was calm, steady, almost unsettling in its certainty. "Money cannot mend what truth has broken. Power cannot heal what love has scarred. What you're looking for isn't sold, and it isn't taught in offices or clinics. Healing doesn't come from wealth. It comes from courage, from kindness, from being willing to face the pain instead of running from it." Her words pierced deeper than he expected. For a man who had been surrounded by polished speeches and empty reassurances, the simplicity of her truth was disarming. He leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to mask the faint tremor that threatened to give him away. "You think you're wiser than all the people I've hired? You think you can do what they couldn't?" His voice was sharp, but beneath it lingered something else, a faint crack in the wall he had built around himself. She didn't argue. She didn't boast. Instead, she simply said, "You've tried their way. Why not try mine?" The weight of her words hung in the air. He searched her face for deceit, for some hidden motive, but found none. There was no greed in her eyes, no hunger for what he owned, no interest in the fortune he represented. All he saw was an unshakable certainty that rattled something inside him he thought had long died. Hope. He looked away, struggling against the instinct to dismiss her, to brush off her audacity as nonsense. And yet, no matter how hard he tried, her voice lingered, her words echoing in his mind. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps desperation, or perhaps something deeper that he refused to name. But in that moment, against all logic, he found himself speaking words he never thought he would. "Fine, I'll listen, but don't expect me to believe so easily." The girl only nodded, her expression unreadable as though she had expected nothing less. And so, the stage was set. An unlikely bond between a man drowning in sorrow and a girl who claimed she could mend the very thing he believed was beyond repair. He remained skeptical, his heart guarded, but for the first time in years, he allowed a sliver of light to seep into the cracks. And though he didn't know it yet, this simple agreement would be the beginning of a journey that would change him forever. The following morning felt different, though he couldn't quite explain why. He woke in his penthouse, surrounded by glass walls and silver silence, the city stretching endlessly below him. Normally, his routine was precise. Emails before coffee, calls before breakfast, schedules mapped to the very second. But her words from the cafe echoed in his mind, pulling at him with a persistence he couldn't ignore. He found himself staring at the glowing screen of his phone, dozens of unread messages demanding his attention, yet for the first time he hesitated. He remembered her simple challenge. Slow down. Notice the world. Against every instinct, he placed the phone face down on the table and walked out the door without it. It felt reckless, almost foolish, as though he had abandoned control of his empire, but something inside him urged him forward. When he met her again, she didn't look surprised, as if she had known he would come. Without explanation, she led him away from the glass towers and polished streets that had always defined his world. They walked through narrow lanes where laughter replaced car horns and walls were painted not with advertisements, but with murals of color and history. He felt restless, his hands itching for his phone, his mind racing with thoughts of meetings left unanswered. She noticed his unease but didn't scold him. Instead, she pointed to the simple things. A child balancing on the edge of a fountain, giggling as though the world was his playground. Two neighbors sitting on a porch sharing bread, their conversation more valuable than the meal itself. An old man fixing a broken bicycle with patience that money could never buy. At first, he dismissed these sights as trivial, distractions for those who had no ambition. But as minutes turned to hours, he began to feel something stir inside him. These people had nothing compared to him, no luxury, no empire, no grand fortune, yet they carried a lightness he hadn't felt in years. He caught himself watching the children, their games needing no expensive toys, just imagination and joy. He listened to families laughing over bowls of soup, their voices warm and genuine in ways his cold, silent dinners had never been. He found himself slowing his steps, breathing more deeply, as if for the first time he was seeing the world instead of just moving through it. Still, it wasn't easy. His mind rebelled, reminding him of his losses, of the betrayal that had cut him open years ago. He remembered the way trust had turned to ashes, the way love had been shattered, leaving him hollow. The weight of that past clung to him like chains. One afternoon, as they sat under a tree in a quiet park, he finally broke the silence. His voice was low, almost ashamed as he told her about the heartbreak that had left him cold. He spoke of a love that had betrayed him, of promises that had turned to lies, of people who had used his heart as easily as they used his wealth. He confessed how the pain had driven him to bury himself in work, building walls of steel and glass so no one could hurt him again. Through it all, she didn't interrupt. She didn't offer pity, nor did she diminish his suffering. She simply listened, her eyes steady, her silence heavy with understanding. When he had poured out everything, when his words finally gave way to a trembling breath, she spoke softly. Pain doesn't mean you are weak. It means you are alive. It means you cared, and that makes you human. You buried it because you thought it would protect you, but healing doesn't come from hiding. It comes from facing the wound and choosing to grow from it. Her words struck deeper than any counsel he had ever received. No therapist had said it so plainly, no friend had dared to. He realized that in her simplicity lay a truth he had been running from. Pain was not the enemy. It was proof that he had once loved, once trusted, once lived fully. To deny it was to deny himself. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time he didn't see a stranger offering foolish promises. He saw someone who carried wisdom far beyond her years, someone who had seen life from angles he never would. Day after day she brought him back to these moments, small acts, simple lessons. A walk through a crowded street where strangers greeted one another by name. A visit to an elderly neighbor who spoke of losing everything in war, yet never losing hope. A shared meal with a family who had almost nothing but insisted he eat until he was full. Each encounter was a mirror, showing him that the emptiness he felt wasn't because the world lacked meaning, but because he had closed himself off from it. Slowly, the ice around his heart began to crack. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, painting the sky in colors that seemed almost unreal, he found himself whispering a thought he had never dared to believe. Maybe you can fix my heart after all. It wasn't a declaration, not yet, but a seed of belief. For the first time in years, he admitted to himself that healing might be possible, that perhaps his story wasn't finished. She said nothing in response, only smiled faintly, as though she had known all along that this moment would come. And though he remained uncertain, one truth was clear. Something inside him had shifted, something that no amount of wealth or power had ever managed to move. Just when the fog around his heart seemed to be lifting, the world struck him with a blow so sharp it felt as though fate was testing his every step forward. News broke of a scandal that threatened to unravel his empire. A trusted partner, someone he had relied on for years, had betrayed him, embezzled money, falsified reports, and dragged his name into a storm of accusations. Overnight, headlines painted him as careless, whispers in boardrooms turned to open ridicule, and the empire he had worked his whole life to build stood on the edge of collapse. The weight of it pressed on his chest like an old wound reopening, and for the first time in months, the darkness he thought he had left behind came rushing back. The old habits returned swiftly, like wolves he had once tamed but never truly killed. Anger flared in him, hot and uncontrollable. Distrust poisoned his thoughts. He looked at everyone as an enemy, every voice as deceit, every gesture as manipulation. He shut himself in, retreating behind locked doors and guarded walls, pushing away the fragile hope he had begun to nurture. And when she appeared, calm as ever, trying to remind him of what he had learned, his fury turned on her. His words were sharp, laced with bitterness and pain. You made me believe things could change. You gave me false hope. And look at me. Now, I'm a fool, broken all over again. She didn't flinch, nor did she try to defend herself. She simply stood there, letting his anger pour out like a storm. When his voice finally broke into silence, she spoke only one sentence, quiet but powerful enough to cut through the noise in his mind. You can lose everything, but if you hold on to bitterness, you lose yourself too. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him in the echo of his own despair. Alone, the walls of his penthouse closed in on him. He stared at the city lights that once filled him with pride, now blurred by the weight of failure pressing on his shoulders. He replayed her words again and again, trying to push them aside, but they clung to him like a shadow. Bitterness had already begun to wrap itself around his soul, and he realized with a chilling clarity how quickly pain could consume him when he let it. The truth stung. He had fallen back into the very patterns she had warned him about. Night after night, he wrestled with himself. The easy choice was surrender. To drown in rage, to fight everyone, to shut down completely. But her voice lingered, not as a demand, but as a reminder. He began to see flashes of what she had shown him. The children laughing in the streets, the families sharing their meals with joy, the old man who had lost everything yet never lost his hope. He remembered her steady eyes when he had confessed his heartbreak, the way she had told him that pain was not weakness but proof of being alive. Slowly, the storm in him began to break, and in its place came a fragile but powerful decision. He would not let bitterness define him again. With that choice, his path shifted. He returned to his offices not with fury but with determination. Instead of lashing out, he faced the betrayal with clarity, cutting ties where needed but refusing to let vengeance guide him. He spoke to his employees not as tools for profit, but as people who shared his burden, offering them honesty instead of hollow reassurances. He treated negotiations with compassion, even when suspicion tugged at him. For the first time in his career, he led not with fear, but with humanity. Rebuilding was not easy. The scandal left scars, the betrayal left lessons, and the empire he had crafted would never look the same. But beneath it all, something had changed. He found himself speaking to strangers more kindly, listening more deeply, noticing the small details he once ignored. In the face of crisis, he had chosen courage over despair, growth over destruction. And it was not the empire that gave him strength. It was her lessons echoing in his heart. When the dust finally began to settle, when the chaos had quieted and his name was no longer smeared across every headline, he realized that what he had gained mattered far more than what he had lost. His business stood, though altered, but more importantly, he stood taller within himself. Yet one thing was missing: her. The girl who had planted the seed of change, who had challenged him, who had walked away rather than argue when his anger flared. He searched for her, driven not by guilt but by gratitude, by the need to tell her the truth he now understood. And at last, after days of looking, he found her in the same quiet corners where their journey had begun. When their eyes met, he felt no arrogance, no defense, only the deep, humbling recognition that she had been right all along. His voice was steadier now, stripped of pride, filled instead with sincerity. He admitted what once seemed impossible to say, that she had given him something no wealth, no empire, no power could ever provide: peace of heart. And in that moment, as the city buzzed around them unaware, a broken man finally embraced the truth that healing had never been about rebuilding what was lost, but about finding who he was meant to be all along. When he finally stood before her again, the weight of everything he had endured pressed heavily on his chest. But this time, it did not crush him, it steadied him. There were no rehearsed speeches, no carefully chosen words, no grand displays of power. For perhaps the first time in his life, he simply spoke from the heart. He thanked her, not with jewels or money, not with offers of comfort she had never asked for, but with something far rarer: genuine gratitude. His voice trembled as he admitted that she had given him what wealth could not, what power had failed to secure, what time had nearly stolen away: peace within himself. Her eyes softened at his words, but she only shook her head gently, reminding him that healing was not a gift she had given, but a path he had chosen to walk. "It is not a moment," she told him quietly. "It is a journey. And now it is your turn to carry the light forward, not just for yourself, but for others." Her words stayed with him like a promise. From that day forward, his life began to take a new shape. Where once his fortune was a fortress that separated him from the world, it became a bridge that connected him to it. He redirected his wealth, no longer using it solely to build towers of glass or secure his own comfort. Instead, he began funding schools where children could dream freely, creating opportunities for education where doors had once been closed. He started programs that gave struggling families not just aid, but dignity and a chance to rise. He poured resources into communities forgotten by the rich, ensuring food, shelter, and care for those who had none. And with every act he felt something shift inside him. The emptiness that had once haunted him began to fade, replaced by a steady warmth that came not from being admired, but from making a difference. The transformation was not sudden, nor was it flawless. There were still days when his past tugged at him, when bitterness threatened to creep back into his heart. But now he had tools she had given him: patience, perspective, the understanding. That pain was not a curse, but a teacher. Slowly, those lessons became the foundation of his new life. The man who had once measured his worth by numbers and possessions now measured it by lives touched and hearts lifted. He began to treat everyone differently, from the executives in his meetings to the janitors cleaning the halls, offering respect, kindness, and acknowledgement where once there had been only indifference. And through it all, she remained nearby, watching quietly, never seeking recognition or reward. She saw the man he was becoming and knew her role was nearly complete. There was pride in her eyes, but it was not loud or boastful. It was the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed and now saw it bloom. She did not step into the spotlight he offered her, did not accept his attempts to honor her publicly. Instead, she stayed humble, content in the knowledge that her purpose had been fulfilled. One evening, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, now no longer a prison of solitude but a vantage point of gratitude, he allowed himself to reflect. The skyline that once mocked his loneliness now looked different. Every light in every window reminded him of lives being lived, of families, of laughter, of resilience. He thought of how far he had come, from a man consumed by grief to one who carried his scars as symbols of strength. The broken heart that had once ruled him with despair had become the very thing that gave him compassion, the thing that made him human again. And as he remembered that first meeting, her voice echoing boldly, "I can fix your broken heart," he realized the true meaning of her words. She had not mended him with magic, nor with miracles. She had simply shown him the courage to open himself again, the bravery to face his pain instead of hiding it, the wisdom to choose love over bitterness. That was the real healing, and it was a lesson meant not just for him, but for anyone who carried wounds they thought could never be healed. The story did not end with riches regained or empires rebuilt, but with a man who discovered that true wealth was never in the gold or the glass, but in the strength to rise again, in the kindness to lift others, and in the courage to love despite the risk of breaking. And as he turned his gaze toward the horizon, those words came back to him one last time, clear and powerful. "I can fix your broken heart." Only now they no longer belonged to him alone. They were a message to all who had ever doubted that healing was possible. A reminder that no matter how deep the wound, no matter how heavy the sorrow, the heart can be mended not by wealth, but by truth, by kindness, and by love.